Right after the First World War, America felt like a land of pure promise. The 1920s, they were like a party that was never going to end. Machines, medicine, jazz music, everything felt brand new. And everyone, absolutely everyone, was caught up in this belief that they were about to get rich. But this isn't just a story about numbers on a stock ticker. No, we're going to see this whole thing through the eyes of someone who actually lived it, someone who watched that incredible promise turn to dust. And that's our guide for this journey, Jeff Stryker. His words are going to take us through this. His story of how a nation's dream just completely fell apart and the long, hard road to get back up is really the story of millions. So let's start right there, with that sudden, violent shift. The moment the music of the Roaring Twenties came to a dead stop, and all that promise of endless wealth just dissolved into pure, raw panic. For Jeff, who was just a 20-year-old economics student at Columbia at the time, the future looked bright, limitless. But on what became known as Black Thursday, it all just vanished. Share prices didn't just drop, they completely cratered. And remember, there's no instant news back then, no 24-hour cable news, so rumors were just spreading like wildfire, which only fueled the panic. On Wall Street itself, police were actually clashing with desperate shareholders. The heart of American finance was just pure chaos. So, how did a crisis on Wall Street become a catastrophe on Main Street? Well, you have to think of it like a terrible set of dominoes. First, the stock market crashes. Investors are wiped out, so they all rush to the banks to pull out whatever savings they have left. The banks, well, they don't have all that cash on hand, so they start to fail. And that chokes off the loans that factories need to operate. So what happens next? They shut down. And that ultimately leads to mass unemployment. The fire that started in the stock market was now burning in every single American neighborhood. Let's just try to get our heads around the sheer scale of this. In a single week, $30 billion, poof, just gone. To put that in perspective, that was 10 times the entire federal budget at the time. It's an almost unimaginable amount of wealth, all built on speculation and easy credit, that just ceased to exist. And that financial collapse, well, it led to years of deep, profound human suffering. This next part of the story is all about that great despair, that feeling of total hopelessness under an administration that seemed completely lost and overwhelmed by the crisis. For Jeff, who eventually found himself living on the street, this crisis wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about this, a medieval hunger, he called it. That one phrase, man, it just hits you. It reminds us that behind every stock market point that was lost, there was a real person suffering a kind of poverty that modern America thought it had left in the past. And if you lost your home, this is where you found refuge, in these huge, sprawling shantytowns that people bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles. Jeff described them as just mazes of scrap metal and string built on mud and despair. But the most haunting memory for him wasn't even the cold. It was the sight of mothers who had nothing, absolutely nothing, to feed their newborn babies. It's just a heartbreaking symbol of a nation's collapse. By 1932, all that public anger finally just boiled over. 20,000 World War I veterans, they called themselves the Bonus Army, marched on Washington to demand a payment they'd been promised. But President Hoover, afraid the country would go bankrupt, refused. And then he sent the U.S. Army, led by none other than Douglas MacArthur, to drive them out. The soldiers used tear gas, a weapon people grimly started calling the Hoover ration. The violence that followed really sealed Hoover's image as a president who was just completely out of touch with his people's suffering. But out of all that desperation came a huge demand for change. So let's get to the big turning point in our story, the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his promise of a new deal for the American people. I mean, you really couldn't have two more different leaders. Hoover had become a symbol of stagnation, tied down by this hands-off economic philosophy. FDR, on the other hand, was the personification of action. He promised to experiment, to just try something, anything. And he put together this amazing team of progressive experts from Columbia University, his brains trust, to help make it happen. And man, did he act. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt's team just unleashed this storm of new laws. They stabilized the banks, they regulated industry, and maybe most importantly, they put people back to work. Our guy Jeff Stryker actually got a small job as a runner between the old and new administrations. So he got to see firsthand this whirlwind of activity and this feeling of hope finally coming back to Washington. And to pay for all this, of course, they needed new tax revenue. So what's one way to do that? Well, in 1933, they ended Prohibition, that great symbol of the 1920s. And as Jeff put it, just like pretty much every other American, he raised his glass to that. But the path to recovery, well, it was never going to be a straight line. While Washington was busy rolling out the New Deal, the rest of the country was fighting multiple crises all at once. A massive ecological disaster on the plains, a huge uprising of industrial workers, and a brand new government effort to capture it all on film. So while the politicians in D.C. were grappling with economic policy, the Great Plains were literally blowing away. A photographer named Arthur Rothstein described the arrival of a dust storm. He said it was this dull roar that just blocked out the sun, followed by this whistling wind that felt like the world was ending. And here's the crazy part. This wasn't some act of God. This was a man-made catastrophe. The intensive farming of the 1920s had basically stripped the land of all its natural defenses. So when a drought hit, there was nothing left to hold the topsoil down. This kicked off one of the biggest migrations in American history, as hundreds of thousands of ruined families, the Okies, packed up everything they owned and headed west on Route 66, just looking for a new start. At the exact same time, all that despair from the early 30s was turning into anger. All across the country, workers who had just recently been standing in soup lines were now standing up for their rights. They came up with new tactics, like the famous sit-down strikes in Detroit's auto plants, where they literally occupied the factories, demanding fair wages and the right to unionize. It was a really radical shift in the balance of power. So with all this turmoil, all this struggle going on, how did America even see itself? The government realized it needed to document what was happening, and let's be honest, to shape how the public understood it. And this is where Jeff's story picks back up. He landed a job at the new Farm Security Administration, or FSA, working for a guy named Roy Stryker. Their mission? To create a complete photographic portrait of America in crisis. This was a massive photography project. You gotta understand, it was part documentation and it was part propaganda. The goal was to put a human face on this crisis and to build public support for the New Deal. So they sent photographers like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans out into the country to capture the faces of these invisible people. And their images, well, they became the defining icons of the entire era. And this brings us to the end of the story. And, well, it's a complicated and controversial one. The recovery from the Depression was incredibly fragile, and it would ultimately take another, even bigger global catastrophe to finally pull America out of its economic slump for good. So by 1937, it really seemed like the worst was over. Roosevelt, believing the economy had recovered, decided to cut back on New Deal spending. And the result was a complete disaster. The stock market crashed again, wiping out almost all the gains from the past few years. It was a brutal lesson in just how fragile that recovery was, and it forced the administration to completely reverse course and ramp up public spending once again. Now, it's so important to remember this was a global crisis. And as you can see here, different countries responded in drastically different ways. While democracies like the US were using social programs to try and preserve liberty, the rising totalitarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan were using force and violence to impose their ideologies, and that was setting the stage for a massive worldwide conflict. Here's the hard truth. While the New Deal offered absolutely essential relief, it didn't actually end the Depression. So what did? The massive total economic mobilization for World War II. Building the arsenal of democracy for the Allies, and then entering the war itself created a level of federal spending and employment that finally pulled the nation out of its decade-long slump. It put 6 million unemployed Americans to work, either in factories or in uniform. And so we end back with Jeff, surrounded by